the 17th of September 1943, 12 British commandos boarded a Halifax bomber at an isolated airbase near Cairo. Their mission was top secret. The orders had come from Winston Churchill himself to land behind enemy lines in German-occupied Yugoslavia and make a deal with the communist resistance led by Josip Tito. The man leading the mission had been specially chosen by Churchill. He was a soldier, a politician, and an aristocrat, Fitzroy Maclean.
The fact that Tito was a roaring Bolshevik and he was a roaring conservative didn't mean that they couldn't cooperate against their abominable enemy.
But Churchill and Maclean were taking a huge risk. In siding with Tito, they might wake a monster who would turn Yugoslavia into a totalitarian state. But the alternative was even worse. This is the story of a wartime gamble that paid off. How a Scottish conservative aristocrat befriended a ruthless communist and formed the unlikeliest of coalitions. Together, Maclean and Tito galvanized the resistance who helped win the war in the Balkans and shape the post-war Europe. Josip Tito would lead a stable, independent Yugoslavia for over 30 years. And Fitzroy Maclean would be admired as one of the key players in the secret war. On the 6th of April 1941, the Axis armies of Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary invaded Yugoslavia. Within 2 weeks, 17,000 civilians were dead. The Yugoslav army had collapsed, and a cloud of fear descended across the country. Bato Tomasevich lived with his family in the Montenegrin town of Cetinje.
I heard a noise of planes approaching Cetinje. And I ran out in the courtyard. So I called my brother, and there was a girl from school. We saw some small black spots coming out of the planes. My brother recognized that these were bombs. And the bomb exploded right in the courtyard. Both my brother and myself were saved, but the girl was hit by a bomb and disappeared.
Yugoslavia was a country ripe for takeover. It had been created out of the ruins of World War I, from regions containing radically different people, divided by race, religion, culture, heritage, and even language. It was a volatile mix. Hitler exploited those divisions. Some, like the Croats, welcomed their German conquerors. Others, like the Serbs, loyal to their king, would have much to fear. The Nazis dismembered Yugoslavia. An independent state of Croatia was set up. The rest of the country was occupied by Axis powers. Thousands fled, including the Yugoslavian government and the heir to the throne, King Peter II. They found their way to Britain, to rule in exile. But some men had no intention of running away. One of them was Serbian Colonel Draza Mihailović of the Yugoslav army.
Mihailović stayed behind. His expertise was guerrilla, and he moved out into the mountains and produced a band of people who would be in the mountains with him, raising difficulties for the Germans.
Another who stayed behind was Josip Broz, who preferred to be called Tito, meaning do this or do that. Unlike the Serbian Mihailovic, Tito was born a Croat. After a distinguished military career, he turned to politics. Tito spent many years in Moscow, where in 1937 Stalin appointed him Secretary General of the Yugoslav Communist Party. After the German invasion, Tito was instructed by Moscow to do his bit for the defense of the Soviet motherland by harassing the Germans in Yugoslavia. So Tito began recruiting a guerrilla force. Drawn from all over Yugoslavia, they became known as simply the Partisans. Tito's communist ideology attracted people across national divides. By late 1941, the Partisans numbered 80,000. They were based in the forest near the town of Jatse. 120 miles east of them were Mihailovic's guerrillas in the Serbian hilltop town of Ravna Gora. Mihailovic began raising his guerrilla army to fight the Germans so that the king could one day reclaim his country. He recruited his guerrillas almost exclusively from royalist Serbia. Many of their fathers had fought in the First World War. Among them were the Chetniks, who had perfected the art of guerrilla warfare over 400 years of Turkish occupation. Mihailovic's men adopted their name. There were now 2 anti-German guerrilla forces in Yugoslavia. The problem for the British was which of these 2 forces should they support? The natural choice for Churchill and his war cabinet was to back Mihailovic. He was a royalist and he hated communism like Churchill. But soon the situation would become even more confusing. Royalist Chetniks began fighting the Communist Partisans. A full-scale civil war erupted. Thousands were slaughtered. In fact, more Yugoslavs would be killed by Yugoslavs than by Germans during the war. That winter, the Germans took ground from both sides, easily. News of the conflict reached London, where the Yugoslav government in exile begged the British to help Mihailovic. And at first that seemed the most likely outcome. Then 2 pieces of information changed everything. British intelligence headquarters for the Balkans was based here in Cairo, Egypt, where Colonel Cleveland Keble had been studying the efforts of Mihailovic's Chetniks. When Churchill came to Cairo to meet other world leaders in January 1943, Keble briefed him on the situation. He told him that he had evidence that Mihailovic was ineffective in fighting the Germans, and perhaps Tito might be a better bet. Even more damning evidence reached London from a crack team of codebreakers based at Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. They intercepted traffic from German radio transmissions all over Europe on captured Enigma machines. The traffic was called Ultra. It revealed the true nature of the fight in Yugoslavia.
Ultra made it clear that Mihailovic and the Italians were getting on quite well, and the Germans were not much afraid of Mihailovic. They were, on the other hand, terrified of Tito, who was killing a lot of them.
So Churchill made a momentous decision. He would ditch Mihailovic and back Tito.
It is on the strength of these reports that the British government decided to give all-out help to the partisans, something, by the way, that they certainly were not getting from the Russians.
The trouble was, Churchill knew nothing about Tito and his partisans. Who was this person? Did he even exist? And if he did, he was a communist, so could he be trusted? Churchill told his foreign secretary, "What we want is a daring ambassador leader with these hardy and hunted guerrillas." That ambassador was to be Captain Fitzroy Maclean. Fitzroy Maclean was perhaps the least likely person to ask to make a deal with a communist. In fact, he hated them. He was born on the 11th of March 1911 into one of Scotland's oldest Highland families. His was a family fiercely proud of its military traditions, one which stretched as far back as the Jacobite Rebellion. The family motto was, "Thank God, I'm a Maclean." He went to Eton and then studied Latin, Greek, and German at Cambridge. And when he graduated, could have done anything. But he chose to join the elite ranks of the diplomatic service. He passed his entrance exam in 1933 with flying colours, and a year later was awarded his first overseas posting to Paris. Maclean's next 5 years as a diplomat abroad would influence the rest of his life. For a 24-year-old, Paris was an exciting place to be, and he was able to rub shoulders with all the leading figures of world politics, including Winston Churchill. It would mark the start of a significant friendship. He was also an enthusiastic member of the Paris party scene. It brought him into contact with a group of Muscovites fleeing communism in their own country. He soon formed a deep fascination for all things Russian, so he applied for a posting to Moscow. His colleagues thought he was mad. Maclean arrived in Russia at the height of Stalin's murderous Great Purges. Under Stalin's orders, thousands of senior Communist Party members were executed. They included Lenin's close friend and founding member of the party, Nikolai Bukharin. Maclean personally witnessed his 9-day trial in March 1938. It left him disgusted and sealed his lifelong loathing for communism. Then Stalin did something that terrified him.
The lights began to burn all night in Moscow. And on August 21st, 1939, the world was set on its heels by the announcement of a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which they agreed not to fight each other. Here were the admitted arch-enemies in a state of apparent friendship. It was too fantastic to make any sense. It didn't.
The shock deal signed by these two sworn enemies was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Maclean was convinced that world peace was in jeopardy. He later wrote, "It seemed to me that by linking two of the most blood-soaked regimes in history, war was now inevitable." He was right, because the pact had more serious implications than even he had imagined. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. the same time, Stalin's Red Army invaded from the east. A secret clause in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact gave the two nations license to carve up Poland. The world had no idea until the two armies met at Brest-Litovsk. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Fitzroy Maclean raced back to London desperate to join up. But as a member of the Foreign Office, he wasn't allowed to. So he spent 2 frustrating years in London. But eventually, he found a loophole. By standing for Parliament, he'd be obliged to resign from the Foreign Office. When Winston Churchill heard of the manner of Maclean's resignation, he jokingly accused him of using the Mother of Parliaments as a public convenience. Maclean then went to the nearest army recruitment office and joined his father's old unit, the Cameron Highlanders. He soon made up for lost time. Maclean was posted to North Africa, where he joined the newly formed SAS. He also met and became great friends with Winston Churchill's son, Randolph. Then in July 1943, he was summoned to London by Randolph's father. From there, the recently promoted brigadier was driven to the Prime Minister's country estate, Chequers, in Buckinghamshire. When the two met, Churchill was unequivocal about Maclean's mission: to find out who Tito was and win his trust.
I said, what is the purpose of my mission? And he said, well, first and foremost, it's military, to find out quite simply who is killing the most Germans and how we can help them to kill more. And I said, what about the political implications? These people are communists. And he said they are secondary.
During the meeting, events on the other side of Europe made Maclean's mission even more urgent.
Allied troops took this vital rock in the summer of 1943. The effect of Sicily's fall was electric. Italy surrendered, the first of the Axis partners to capitulate.
On the 8th of September, Italian troops laid down their arms and marched home, including those in Yugoslavia. As they withdrew, they abandoned their weapons. Tito's partisans managed to seize the arms and supplies of 10 Italian divisions. His army was now bristling with modern military hardware, making them even more attractive to the Allies. All they needed was coordination and direction. The next day, Fitzroy Maclean parachuted into Yugoslavia. With him was a hand-picked team of 11 engineers, sappers, soldiers, and intelligence officers. The drop went perfectly, and Maclean's team landed in the middle of partisan country. Tito knew they were coming and sent horses and an escort. After a 2-hour ride high into the Bosnian hills, they climbed up a track to a ruined castle overlooking the town of Jadci. Maclean was about to discover who the mysterious Tito really was. He spoke in 1964 about the moment they first met.
Tito in those days was a shadowy figure as far as the outside world was concerned. Some people said he was a committee, others a handsome young woman, others that he didn't exist at all. I found a tough, determined, middle-aged man who, with no outside help, had built up from nothing not just a scratch guerrilla force, but a formidable political and military machine.
Maclean's task was to to find out if Tito and his men would join the Allies and fight the Germans. He sent a series of messages to the Prime Minister to detail his progress. They showed from the beginning that Tito was a man Maclean could do business with.
As a personality, I found Tito much easier to get on with than most communists I'd met in Russia and elsewhere. He made no secret of being a communist. On the contrary, he gloried in it. But for a communist, he was surprisingly ready to see both sides of a question and to take a decision there and then without reference to higher authority. He struck me as being perfectly sure of himself, a principal rather than a subordinate.
As they got to know each other, this Scottish aristocrat developed a growing admiration for the hardline communist.
An unusual breadth of outlook and independence of mind, a readiness to see both sides of a question, a never-failing sense of humor, even in those grim days, an unashamed delight in the minor pleasures of life, and finally an intense national pride which he shared with every single one of his followers.
Maclean also reported to London that by his estimates, Tito's partisans now numbered almost 250,000, easily the biggest potential force of resistance in Europe. The question was, could they fight? Because by late 1943, the Allies needed them. In Italy, American and British forces were driving north, but facing stiff German resistance. Maclean received a message from Supreme Allied Commander in Italy, General Maitland Wilson, known as Jumbo. The Trieste-Ljubljana Railway was a key supply line for the German army in Italy. Jumbo told Maclean to get Tito's men and sever that line. So he and Tito hand-picked a group of men, and they marched to the target. The railway was heavily guarded, but Maclean and the partisans managed to fight their way through and set their charges. The outcome was devastating. The supply line to Italy was disrupted for weeks. Tito and Maclean had passed their test, and it didn't go unnoticed. On the 1st of December 1943, Allied leaders Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met for the first time in Tehran. High on the agenda was the situation in Yugoslavia. The so-called Big Three pledged to give all possible help to the partisans. 9 days later, Churchill flew to Cairo from the Tehran conference. Fitzroy Maclean was waiting for him. Churchill told him of the decision taken in Tehran to step up the support for Tito. But Maclean voiced concerns.
I said that I had no doubt that the partisans would take power once the war was over and would set up a communist regime. At that point, Winston interrupted me and said, "Do you intend to make Yugoslavia your home after the war? Do you intend to live there?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, neither do I, and therefore had we not better leave it to the Yugoslavs to work out what kind of regime they want?"
Maclean returned to Yugoslavia with a clear mission: to rearm and motivate the partisans and drive the Germans out of the country. This time, Churchill's son Randolph was on the mission. Maclean had requested his presence, considering him thoroughly dependable, possessing both endurance and determination.
Churchill went partly out of the spirit of adventure and partly because his father asked him to, sending his son a sort of pledge to Tito of how strongly he was going to support Tito and Tito's cause. Tito, I think, was touched by this.
Maclean told the partisans to prepare safe landing strips because the Allies were on their way. Bato Tomasevich was one of 18 teams who prepared the runways.
I was assigned with a group of about 10 partisans to go on to a part where was an improvised airport created. Our job was to cut wood during the day and to put it around so that we could light a bonfire at midnight when the British transporter would arrive.
Somewhere in Italy, trucks roll in with supplies for partisan forces in the Balkans. Here at a secret airport, American and British forces are cooperating with Yugoslav guerrillas to maintain this efficient and vital supply line.
The partisans had no idea how much equipment they were about to get. In just 2 nights, they received as much as Mihailovich had in 2 years. Within just a few weeks, British and American planes had delivered or dropped 100,000 rifles, 50,000 machine guns, 1,380 mortars, over 600,000 grenades, almost 100 million rounds of ammunition, 700 radio sets, and 250,000 pairs of boots.
Uniforms, arms, ammunition, food, and what was the most important, recognition as allies of British. So I became dressed in English uniform with the British arms, with the British machine gun.
With American involvement came the propaganda machine. Partisans were followed everywhere by film crews. The conflict in Yugoslavia suddenly acquired glamour.
Women fight side by side with the men, marching against the enemy wherever found.
But one person who was not pleased by this was Colonel Draza Mihailovich. So the royalist Serbian guerrilla leader, still hiding out in the mountains with his Chetniks, tried to win back British favor. His territory straddled a key German supply line, the railway to Greece. He ordered his men to destroy a bridge on that line. A British agent was with him and took these pictures as it was blown up. But the operation backfired when the credit was given to Tito's partisans. Tito, now emboldened, formed a National Council of Liberation, a rival authority to the Yugoslavian government in exile in London. And he appointed himself Supreme Military Commander, Marshal of Yugoslavia. It seemed an appropriate time for Maclean to raise the issue of Tito's plans for Yugoslavia after the war. At first, Maclean received reassuring answers. As this telegram to Churchill shows, Tito had no intention of making Yugoslavia part of the Soviet Union or imposing Soviet economics. Now that they had nothing to fear, the order was given that all British contact with the Chetniks must cease. British foreign policy had turned full circle. For Mihailovich and his Chetniks, the decision was a catastrophe. Abandoned by the Allies, thousands of them changed sides and joined the Nazis. Churchill had further justification for dropping Mihailovich. Now the operation entered a new phase. By the spring of 1944, this military exercise changed from one of supply and support to full-scale Allied collaboration. The Yugoslavs were given their own air force. The RAF Balkan Air Force was made up of 15 types of Allied aircraft, including these Spitfires. Air superiority had the power to make a huge difference to the war. The man who was put in charge of all bomber and fighter operations was Fitzroy Maclean. Not only could he now coordinate all future supply drops to the partisans, but he could also plan to attack strategic targets from the air. He would later say the Air Force gave him an incalculable advantage in obtaining quick results. Maclean's Air Force would swing the battle comprehensively in favor of the partisans. After the Air Force came the ground troops. British and American commandos were dropped into the country to train and fight with the partisans. Here, Fitzroy Maclean inspects and addresses some of the Allied troops after their arrival. They trained the partisans like a professional army, preparing them to retake their country. But other events were moving just as fast.
The men on the ground pushed north, and in 3 weeks were in Rome.
By the middle of 1944, it was clear that the Germans were losing the war. In Italy, Rome had fallen. And the British Army were fighting for Florence. In the east, the Russians were advancing rapidly, rolling back German gains. And early in June, the Allies landed in northern France.
Our men were in France. They had crossed a few dozen miles of water. They faced hundreds of miles of land between them and Berlin.
It was time to focus on what shape Europe would take once the war was won. So Churchill decided that he should meet Tito himself. The news reached Fitzroy Maclean, who was with Tito at a new partisan base on the small Dalmatian island of Vis. From here, he and Tito flew to the liberated Italian city of Naples to meet Churchill. The royalist Yugoslav government in exile and many other senior Allied commanders also traveled for the conference. On the 17th of June, they seemed to reach a deal. Once Yugoslavia was free, Tito agreed to somehow work with the government in exile. He even agreed that King Peter could retain his crown. The only question was, would Tito keep his word? By now, the war in Yugoslavia was nearing its climax. In September 1944, Stalin's Red Army crossed the border into Yugoslavia and raced towards the capital, Belgrade. The bulk of Tito's partisans were already massing on the outskirts of the city. In the face of the assault, the Germans retreated. With liberation on the horizon, Fitzroy Maclean wanted the partisans to attack the Germans as they withdrew. The railway line near Leskovac in Serbia was the first target. Leaving Tito in his headquarters, Maclean assembled a force of men and led them on a march to the town. He was joined by his old friend Randolph Churchill and the famous novelist Evelyn Waugh, a new recruit who trained as a commando As they reached the outskirts of Leskovac, Maclean called in Allied bombers to unleash their deadly cargo. Led by Maclean, the partisans then attacked on the ground, blowing up railway tracks and bridges. Partisans were now taking control all over the country. Bato Tomasevich had joined them at the age of 15. Thanks to British support, his unit reached his hometown of Cetinje and liberated it in early October.
Seeing the houses, including my house where I lived, and people who I knew in Cetinje, dressed in British uniform with a revolver and a bomb and a machine gun and a cap with a red star, of course, on the cap. That was the only thing that was not British. But somebody said, now you look like a British except for the red star. My commander said, don't worry, wait. When the proletarian revolution succeeds, the British will be wearing the same red star as you do.
Just a few miles west of Cetinje, Fitzroy Maclean and his men marched on looking for new targets. But a messenger caught up with them. He brought strange news. Tito had gone missing from Viz. Maclean raced back to Viz to investigate and discovered something disturbing. An unidentified aircraft had landed at Viz and taken off again with Tito on board. Where on earth had he gone? Maclean thought that Tito had travelled inland to coordinate the final battle for Belgrade. Realizing that the end of the war was near, he grabbed a small team and headed for the city himself. They arrived as the battle for the city was at its peak. $150,000 German soldiers tried to defend the city, including from a flotilla of anti-aircraft boats on the River Danube. But after 16 days of fighting, the Red Army and the partisans broke through their lines. On the 20th of October, the Germans were driven out.
They liberated Belgrade, capital of Yugoslavia.
It was a triumph for the Red Army, but also for Tito, Maclean, and the partisans. But the fighting was far from over. As the Germans withdrew, they conducted a scorched earth policy, destroying everything in their wake. They retreated to a line 30 miles north of Belgrade, committing atrocities as they went.
When Belgrade was liberated, I was stationed in Belgrade. The job of my unit was just like in Montenegro, to go around with a list of people, names and faces, photos, and look for people we can identify as criminals.
But his mission took him dangerously close to German lines.
We arrived practically by mistake right into the German front, into the German front. The Germans started firing at us, and our driver turned, and the vehicle overturned, and I hit my head against a sharp rock.
His comrades found another vehicle and rushed him to a field hospital in Belgrade.
I only heard somebody knocking at my head, and as though somebody was hitting with some sharp object. When eventually I regained consciousness, I was told that I had been injured, and the doctors tried to clear it by using simply a hammer and a chisel.
Tomasevich was gravely ill. Medicine was in short supply. He would simply have to wait his turn for treatment. But then he had a stroke of luck.
Her name is Stana Tomasevich. When questioned as to how many Germans and Chetniks she has killed, she calmly said with a slight smile and in a modest way, "I have killed some."
Bato's sister Stana was leader of one of the partisan youth brigades. She'd heard about her brother's injuries and raced to be with him. Using her influence, she had his treatment prioritized, even donating her own blood to save him. After 3 months, in agony, he began to recover. It was the end of the war, but the beginning of a new start for his country.
I am very proud that I have been in the partisans, that I have fought in the partisans. I have not contributed very much, but at least my family did. My brother paid with his life, and my whole family suffered. I think it was for the benefit of Yugoslavia.
But freedom had come at a great price. To rid Yugoslavia of its occupiers, almost 250,000 partisans had died, and nearly 400,000 had been wounded. A week after the liberation of Belgrade, Maclean found Tito in a villa on its outskirts. Tito revealed that he hadn't been in Belgrade after all. He'd been to Moscow, where he'd received instructions direct from Stalin. Tito now made his move. He reneged on the deal he made in Naples and announced that he would be Yugoslav leader, and there was to be no place for the king or his government. It seemed that Yugoslavia would be turned into the communist state that Maclean had feared.
This was the question that arose in acute form in 1945. To what extent was he going to take his orders from Moscow? A lot had happened to Tito since 1937, when he'd been summoned to Moscow and made Secretary General of the party. In company with hundreds of thousands of his fellow countrymen, he had undergone the hazards and hardships of a savage, bitter war. He'd built up from nothing a great military and political machine. He'd tasted the triumph of ultimate victory. And now, when all was said and done, he could claim that he had driven the Germans from his country by his own efforts and by those of his followers.
The first signs of the kind of leader that Tito would be were alarming. He embarked on a campaign of revenge against the Chetniks. On the 13th of March 1946, his old rival, the Chetniks' leader, Draza Mihailovic, was captured. He went on trial on the 10th of June. He was charged with collaborating with the Germans. His defense was that he had been placed in an impossible position. To save his men and his own skin, he had had to keep all possibilities open. But the judges found him guilty and sentenced him to death. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, Churchill warned of the spread of communism throughout Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. The communist parties, which were very small in all these eastern states of Europe, have been raised to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers and are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control.
So had Churchill and Maclean made a terrible mistake? Should they have continued to support Mihailovic after all? the decision to switch sides looks even stranger when the activities of this man were uncovered. James Klugman was working for British intelligence in Cairo in 1942. It was he who compiled the reports that ultimately influenced Churchill to ditch Mihailovich and support Tito. And it's now known that those reports were biased in favor of Tito. Klugman exaggerated the numbers of partisans under Tito's control and the effectiveness of their attacks on the enemy. In 2002, Klugman was revealed as a devout communist who was at university with the infamous Cambridge 4 spy ring before the war. But despite Maclean's fears that Yugoslavia would come under the influence of Moscow behind an iron curtain, Tito would in fact steer a completely independent course from that of Stalin and the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia would become more peaceful, stable, and affluent than its communist neighbors. That may have been partly due to the efforts of Churchill and Fitzroy Maclean.
In the long term, I think the fact that he had a connection with Churchill during the war encouraged Tito to believe that he mustn't remain necessarily under Stalin's heel. And when Stalin tried to bully him, he flounced out.
For a man born into such a divided country, Josip Tito managed the seemingly impossible. Irrespective of race, religion, or language, Tito united his people with his own brand of communism and kept the peace for over 30 years.
Tito seized power after 3.5 years of bitter fighting, much of it against his own people. He remained in power despite the determined efforts of the Russians to overturn him. He is a revolutionary with a revolutionary program put through. Much of his life has been spent, both figuratively and literally, on the barricades.
Tito's remarkable achievements were highlighted when, within only 11 years of his death in 1980, Yugoslavia tore itself apart again. As for Fitzroy Maclean, he returned to Britain to take up his seat in the House of Commons. He remained devoted to Yugoslavia and Tito for the rest of his life. Maclean and Bato Tomasevich met for the first time in 1953. But Tomasevich's story would be even more extraordinary. He became a diplomat working in Tito's government, and he was one of the very few survivors of the aircraft which crashed on takeoff in Munich in 1958, killing many of Manchester United's Busby Babes. Fitzroy Maclean and Bato Tomasevich remained friends until Maclean's death in 1996.
He was very proud and very pleased that he could contribute to Yugoslavia, and he did made great contribution to Yugoslavia. Without Fitzroy, it would not have been the same place.